Hello, everybody. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's going on here? What's going on? And, I've been trying to do some readings that align with holidays, when Christmas happened, did that when my birthday happened. We don't talk about the other holidays that I missed at the beginning of this year. Um, but when it came to April Fool's Day, I thought, what would be more foolish than being 3 weeks late? I think that's funny. I'm gonna take this off so that it doesn't keep jingling the entire time, or maybe I'll just set it ever so gently upon my skull. Um, there'll just be the gentle tingling throughout the whole video, I guess. I'll try not to move my head a ton. So today we're reading Mr. Nonsense. We've already read Mr. Silly. Mr. Nonsense's counterpart in crime, I would dare say. So yeah, I don't have much to say. I think that it's may as well just get into it. Mr. Nonsense had nope. I haven't read a book in so long. That's a lie. I've read so much of King Rat. That's what we're reading in English. I've read a lot of King Rat. I haven't read anything but King Rat. Because I don't have time to read things other than King Rat now. Anyways. Mr. Nonsense had no sense at all. Not a scrap. I mean, he lived in a tree. A tree! Can you imagine? Well, I can't imagine because birds do it, and birds are real. So I don't know what kind of worldview good old Roger here is trying to push. This is written by Roger, right? Yeah. I don't know what kind of worldview Roger's pushing here, but, yeah, I don't think it's that out of the question that, like, people can live in trees. Well, maybe not people. Like, tree houses exist. May not be the most feasible, but I mean, they exist. So far, this just seems like a guy who's embracing, like, alternate lifestyles, so I mean, more power to him. Why do you live in a tree? Mr. Happy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense. I tried living on the ground, but that was too high up, so I moved to a tree to be nearer to the ground. What nonsense, snorted Mr. Happy. Thank you, replied Mr. Nonsense. You know, good. I want Mr. Happy to snort. I want Mr. Happy to be devastated. I want Mr. Happy to be in the ground. Not, like, dead, but just, like, I want him to walk on the ground and feel like he walks on the ground. I will never forgive him for what he did to Mr. Nobody. Maybe that's a little harsh. I will forgive him at some point. One day we'll hear his side of the story. We'll read Mr. Happy. But until that day comes, he's a bit of an antagonist around these parts. So, more power to Mr. Nonsense, honestly, being able to just take it on the chin and just, like, spit it right back in Mr. Happy's face. More power to him. Less power to him in this case. And do you know what Mr. Nonsense liked to eat? Oatmeal. Nothing wrong with that, you might say. But oatmeal on toast? Really? Why do you like oatmeal on toast? Mr. Nosy asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried oatmeal sandwiches, and I didn't like them. That's a vibe. I'm not a big fan of him grabbing Mr. Nosy's nose like this. I think that definitely we're getting out of the nonsense territory and into the assault territory with that one. Because Mr. Nosy definitely doesn't seem like a, haha, you got me. He seems like a, hey, whoa, whoa, you got my schnoz. But I mean, honestly, oatmeal on toast probably would be fine. It's probably fine. Do you know where Mr. Nonsense sleeps every night? In a rowboat. In his bedroom. In his house. Up a tree. You can never be too prepared. You can never be too prepared. When the floods come, Mr. Nonsense will be the one laughing last. And honestly, like, a boat is kind of a sick bed if you can, like, fit a mattress in it. Like, a boat's kind of a sick bed frame. Not gonna lie. So far, Mr. Nonsense isn't necessarily seeming nonsensical. It seems like he's just living life to the fullest. And, like, can I really fault him for that? I can't. Why do you sleep in a rowboat? Mr. Strong asked him one day. Because, replied Mr. Nonsense, I tried sleeping in a motorboat, and it was somewhat uncomfortable. Mr. Nonsense lives, as you might very well expect, in a country called Nonsense Land. Now, I know somebody else who lives in Nonsense Land. Do you? We do know someone else who lives in Nonsense Land. Honestly, yeah, a rowboat's probably more comfortable than a motorboat, because a motorboat's like metal and stuff. And a rowboat's not as metal-y. It's just a Mr. Strong just being like, ah. Honestly, Mr. Nonsense is living it up. Also, I still don't understand the politics of Mr. Land, because, so, he lives in a country called Nonsense Land, but they all live in Mr. Land, and, like, are these really small countries? Like, are these, like, micronations that form a country? Like, are we looking at, like, an EU type situation, but on a much smaller scale? Is that kind of what we're looking at here? Like, EU, except all the countries are the Vatican? Is that what we're looking at here? I don't know. Anyways. That's right, Mr. Silly. I never said who it was, but it's Mr. Silly. How convenient that we read them in this order. This is Mr. Silly. Arguably, Mr. Nonsense looks more nonsensical than Mr. Silly. I'm getting a lot of nonsense and silliness vibes from Mr. Nonsense, not as much from Mr. Silly. I mean, he's got a hat, and he's got a big nose that covers his eyes, unless that is his eye, and he's like Mike Wazowskiing, but except he just doesn't open his eye. It's ambiguous, but definitely I'm getting more silly, more nonsense vibes from Mr. Nonsense. Also, it's called Nonsense Land. I mean, I'm not saying I believe in, like, birthright and, you know, divine right of kings and stuff, but, like, if it's called Nonsense Land, and he's Mr. Nonsense, everything's fine. Like, how much more do you want? How much more do you want? Anyways, Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense were close friends, and saw a lot of each other. Mr. Nonsense was often at Mr. Silly's house playing with jigsaw puzzles. They used to throw the pieces at each other. How silly. Now that's a little silly. Puzzle etiquette? That does not fly with puzzle etiquette. That's pretty silly. And Mr. Silly was often at Mr. Nonsense's house playing cards. They used to tear them up and see what they They used to tear them up and see who could get the most pieces out of one card. What nonsense. Yeah, I'm not quite sure about those things. That's a little... I don't even know if I would call that nonsense and silly. Like, that's just kind of like... Why would you do that, though? Anyways, this is Mr. Silly's house. We've seen it before. The architect on that one... Jocelyn, you always choose when I'm reading. This is terrible, but it's fine. However, this story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. We're finally getting to what the story's about. This was all exposition. Sheesh. However, the story is about the time it snowed in Nonsense Land. It didn't very often snow, but one winter it did. Now tell me, what color is snow? No, in Nonsense Land when it snows, it doesn't snow white snow. It snows yellow snow. Don't ask me why, but it does. Yellow snow. Now this is pretty nonsense. Jocelyn, I'm begging you, please stop clawing at my shirt. Now this is pretty nonsensical. Yellow snow? You're telling me this yellow snow and it's just regular snow, but it's all the snow is yellow? You're the worst. The things I do for you. I don't know if you can see her head peeking out. Yellow snow, that's a lot. It's just a lot to take in. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of I thought this was Mr. Nonsense's book. And when Mr. Silly woke up one morning, the whole of Nonsense Land was covered. I say, when... Ugh. I say, he said when he looked out of his bedroom window, snow. He was so excited he rushed to Mr. Nonsense's house. Wouldn't it make sense if it was the other way around, because isn't Mr. Nonsense our protagonist? Anyways, this is just a comedic sight, I think. It looks like everything's covered in butter. So I think that's funny. Does this count as a glow-up? I don't think it does. Mr. Nonsense was asleep, in his boat. "Wake up," cried Mr. Silly. "Wake up and come and look out the window." "Whatever on earth is it?" grumbled Mr. Nonsense, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Where are his eyes? Where are his eyes? Are they under his nose? Are they his nose? What do you mean plural eyes? Is he like got a Pan's Labyrinth thing happening? Is that why he wears the gloves? I think I cracked it. Anyways, this is him looking out his window. It looks so stupid with the snow's yellow, but I mean, that's what they're going for. Jocelyn, what are you doing? You want to leave now? I tell you. I don't even remember. Oh, his eyes. He rubbed his eyes. Pan's Labyrinth. That's definitely. It has to be. It must be. "I say," he said, looking out. "Custard." "That isn't custard, you silly banana," cried Mr. Silly. "That's snow." He rushed downstairs. "Come on," he called. And that day, Mr. Silly and Mr. Nonsense had one of the very best days of their lives. They had a snowball fight. Mr. Silly's snowballs were round. That's not very silly. Round snowballs? Pretty vanilla, actually. Ironically enough, because it's not white, but it's vanilla. Mr. Nonsense made snowballs that somehow or another came out sort of square. He made cubes. Now, who pulls out the Tesseract snowballs? Now, that's who wins. I don't know why I'm doing a lot of gesturing with just one finger. It's just a lot of power with how opposable one finger is, especially the index finger. Ooh. It's Nonsense Day. I can be funny. I can be silly. They built a snowman. A very silly, nonsensical sort of snowman. Sheesh. Sheesh. I think that's pretty silly. The proportions are really, really sillying. It's sillying my vibes. "Come on," said Mr. Nonsense that afternoon. "Let's go tobogganing." "But we don't have a toboggan," said Mr. Silly. "Oh, no, we don't," agreed Mr. Nonsense. Mr. Silly thought. "Oh, yes, we do," he cried. Now, I don't want to criticize the art too much for things external to the plot. However, this is supposed to be Mr. Nonsense's book, and I'm getting the feeling that him and Mr. Silly are co-leads. Like, even though the exposition was about Mr. Nonsense, as soon as Mr. Silly was introduced, very much a co-lead type vibe. And Mr. Silly ran back to Mr. Nonsense's house and came back with his bed. "Whee!" they shouted together as they slid faster and faster down the hill in their rowboat toboggan. That's a vibe. Look at them. They're just guys being dudes. They're having fun. We love that. It was a wonderful day. That's it. It was a wonderful day. There's no journey that Mr. Nonsense goes through. It's just a fun day in his life, which, I mean, you know, sometimes it's nice to have just little, simple, silly little books like that. So yeah, I would say that Mr. Silly kind of one-upped him in some categories. Like, Mr. Silly's the one who thought of the boat. Like, if they really wanted to make it feel like Mr. Nonsense's book, like, maybe I just don't know the characterization of Mr. Nonsense and Mr. Silly well enough. I don't want to, I'm not an expert on them, personally, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But, I'm looking at them, and I'm thinking, you could have, if you switched, like, half of these to, like, Mr. Nonsense had the idea instead of Mr. Silly, he'd feel a lot more like the main character. And to me, this feels very, I don't know, feels co-leady, feels like Mr. Nonsense really isn't quite the protagonist here. Or if he is, he's a very passive protagonist, which isn't as endearing. But, anyways, what a lovely time Mr. Nonsense was. I don't know where his eyes are, and I don't know if I want to know. It's just a silly little time. A nonsensical time, some would say. So thank you for joining me. It's been a while, but I'll do these whenever I get the chance, whenever I feel like it. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you around. Toodles. Woo!